very glad to introduce my friend Michael LÖWY for this lecture at the Institute for Comparative Modernities. It is a great pleasure because I have the honor and the privilege of having prepared about a century ago my PhD under his supervision at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales of Paris, where he has taught for many years. Michael LÖWY is a cultural sociologist, an intellectual historian, and an internationally known Marxist thinker. He was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he came from a Jewish family which had emigrated from Vienna at the eve of the Anschluss and studied in Paris in the early 60s with some of the most important scholars of that time, particularly Raymond Aron and Lucien Goldman. He is currently research director emeritus at the French Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique and has taught in many different countries and continents during his long academic career. His work covers a huge spectrum of topics, from classical sociology to political theory, from Marxism to Jewish messianism, from Romanticism to Surrealism, and from the theology of liberation in Latin America to, in more recent times, political ecology or so-called eco-socialism. Forging his own path alongside structuralism, the current that dominated French culture at the time of his intellectual formation, his work has become the locus of an original and powerful encounter between the melancholic spirit of Central European critical theory and the incandescent streams of Latin American politics in the decades that followed the Cuban Revolution, an encounter that took place under the sign of the surrealist imagination. In Michael LÖWY's work, one could say, Walter Benjamin meets Che Guevara. Critical theory overcomes its traditional Eurocentric limitations and abandons its purely contemplative character. This is probably one of the reasons for which his writings found a significant reception beyond the academia. Michael LÖWY is a prolific author whose works have been translated into more than 20 languages. I would like to mention only some of his most significant books that have been translated into English. Georg Lukács from Romanticism to Bolshevism, 1981. Redemption and Utopia, Libertarian Judaism in Central Europe, 1992. On Changing the World, Essays in Political Philosophy from Karl Marx to Walter Benjamin, 1993. The War of Gods, Religion and Politics in Latin America, 1996. Romanticism Against the Tide of Modernity with Robert Serre, 2001. Fire Alarm, reading Walter Benjamin's thesis on the concept of history, 2005. Morning Star, Surrealism, Marxism, Romanticism, Situationism, Utopia, 2010. And finally, Franz Kafka, Subversive Dreamer, 2016. Today he will speak on Marxism and romantic anti-capitalism. So please join me in welcoming Michael LÖWY.
Well, let me first thank the Institute. Sorry, something is missing. let me thank the Institute of Comparative Modernity for inviting me, particularly friend Fuad Maki, and of course Enzo Traverso for his generous presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, my topic is Romanticism and Marxism, Marx and Romanticism. Now, before discussing the relation of Marx or Marxism to Romanticism, perhaps we have to try to define what we mean by Romanticism. Because if you open just a handbook of literary history or an encyclopedia, etc., you will find the apparently obvious idea that Romanticism is a literary movement from the early 19th century. Well, I think this is a much too narrow understanding. If we want to think about the meaning of Romanticism, we need a much broader and deeper approach, which one can find in some writings of Georg Lukács, of Ernst Fischer, Raymond Williams, etc. So I am trying to build on these premises. The first thing we have to understand is that Romanticism is a world view, a Weltanschauung, as the Germans say, which is present in all the spheres of culture. It's literature, art, poetry, painting, philosophy, religion, theology, anthropology, historiography, even political economy. Even political economy, because perhaps some of you are familiar with a pamphlet by Lenin called Against Romanticism in Political Economy. So there exists romanticism even in political economy. So, but what is the meaning, what is the content, what is the concept, what is the begriff of this romantic world view? Well, I believe, and again, building on writing by Lukács, Ernst Fischer, and others, that Romanticism is above all a protest, a cultural protest against modern Western industrial capitalist civilization. It's a rebellion against the spirit of modern capitalist civilization. But a protest and a rebellion in the name of past, pre-modern, pre-capitalist, pre-industrial values, social forms, institutions, etc. So it's a critique of modern industrial capitalist society in the name of the past. Of a past which, of course, is to some extent idealized, romanticized, as one says, but maybe has some relation to reality. So this is the essence, let's say, of Romanticism as I see it. And if one understands Romanticism in these terms, it begins already in the mid of the 18th century, I would say. If I would be pressed hard to give a date, a birth date for Romanticism, I would say 755, which is a year when Jean-Jacques Rousseau published his well-known pamphlet Des origines de l'inégalité parmi les hommes, the origins of inequality among human beings. This is the kind of birth certificate of the Romantic worldview. And then it unfolds, not only in France, but in England, Germany, throughout Europe, and throughout the world, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, of course, and in the 20th century, and in the 21st century too. So Romanticism has not finished. It goes on since Rousseau until our days. That's our hypothesis, right? And you will see I'm not the only one who has this hypothesis. Again, this goes against the grain of mainstream, conventional scholarship on Romanticism, which usually says Romanticism finished either by 1830 or by 1848. We believe that it goes on throughout the 19th century and the 20th, and it's still with us. In other terms, Romanticism is one of the main forms of modern culture, one of the main structures of feeling of modern culture. And of course, with changes, it's far from being always the same thing. It goes through many metamorphoses, transformation, and it is far from being homogeneous. No? It's not a block. It's a kind of galaxy with many stars and planets, and comets, etc. And in this broad galaxy, there are two main poles, a conservative and a revolutionary or utopian pole. Yeah? And most of the styles gravitate around these two poles. Now, what is conservative or reactionary or restitutionist or restorationist Romanticism? It's a Romanticism which is backward looking. It would like to return to the past, yeah? Which of course it cannot, but that's the dream, the utopia, the aspiration. Yeah? Against the present being modern industrial bourgeois civilization, conservative or backward-looking Romanticism wants to return to the past. Now, revolutionary or utopian Romanticism has a different attitude. It does a kind of turn through the past towards the future, an utopian future or a revolutionary future. Yeah? So it's a kind of dialectical movement going to the past, a detour, as the French say, detour by the past against the present towards a projected future. Yeah? That's the spirit of revolutionary Romanticism. So, now, what is common to all forms of Romanticism? Oh yeah, one thing interesting, one important thing to say is that you find in Romanticism these two poles, and sometimes people move from one pole to the other. It means revolutionary romantics, such as the young Schlegel, young Friedrich Schlegel, or the young Samuel Taylor Coleridge, etc., in the older years became more and more conservative, reactionary, anti-revolutionary, etc. But sometimes you have the inverse movement of writers, thinkers, who began as conservative and then became more or less revolutionaries, like Victor Hugo, or a more striking case, William Morris. Yeah? So you have these two kinds of movements, but all remain inside the same worldview, the same romantic worldview. Yes? Now, what Romanticism, as I said, is a cultural protest against modern bourgeois society, but against which aspects of bourgeois society? Well, there are several of them. I will mention only two or three. One is against the disenchantment of the world in southern Quebec, well-known founder Max Weber, means the disappearance of, or marginalization of religion, magic, but also other forms of enchantment. It can be poetry or spirituality or whatever. So disenchantment of the world. Romanticism is a protest against the disenchantment of the world, and often an attempt, kind of desperate attempt to re-enchant the world. Right? And another component of the romantic protest is the protest against the mechanization of the world. With the Industrial Revolution and industrial capitalism, everything becomes mechanical, including human beings. And the third element, perhaps the most important, is a protest against the quantification of life and human relations. Yeah? Means The Romantics believe in qualitative values, which are usually pre-modern values, and which existed in the past, and now are being dissolved, destroyed, by the absolute predominance of purely quantitative values. Yeah? That means in the past, you would judge someone if he is good or bad, stupid or intelligent, but now you judge him if he has 1, 10, 100, 1,000, or $1 million or euros. That's the quantification, the quantifying spirit of capitalism, or as Max Weber would say, the calculating rationality, yeah? Calculating in quantitative terms. So Romanticism is a protest against this, and one of well-known romantic of the 19th century, Thomas Carlyle, denounced this as a kind of new religion, a pagan religion, which he called Maimonism. Yes, from Mammon, which was the name of the god of gold and money in ancient times, of the Bible, biblical times. So he described modern bourgeois society as Maimonism, as a world where the only god is money, or gold. Okay, so this is a kind of very, very general introduction, what I understand by romanticism, yeah? But not only me. Okay. Now let me give one example, a typical romantic text on this issue which I mentioned, the protest against quantification, which goes together with mercantilization. Everything becomes a commodity to be sold in the market. Yeah? So this is a classical romantic argument. Yeah? So I will read a passage which is a good example of this kind of romantic spirit and this romantic point of view, and you will guess who is the author. Okay? Let's make this game. So I'm reading. Fouad cannot play, nor instruments, Okay. Then came a time when all that human beings considered as inalienable became object of exchange, traffic, and could be alienated. A time when the things that till then had been given but never sold, acquired but never bought, such as virtue, love, opinion, science, consciousness, etc., all these things were finally became object of commerce. It is the time of general corruption, of universal venality, the time when everything moral or physical, having become a venal value, was brought to the market to be sold according to its correct value. End of the quote. Any guess? Loud. Come on. Good.
Marx.
Sorry?
Marx.
Karl Marx. Come on. This is a romantic text. He speaks about values which existed in the past, virtue, law.
Rousseau.
Huh?
Rousseau.
Proudhon. Yeah, interesting. Marx, Proudhon. Any other guesses? Huh? Rousseau. Ah, I
That's what I
understood
said.
Proudhon.
Yeah, no, that's what I meant, yeah.
Okay, Proudhon, Rousseau, Marx. More guesses?
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith. Sorry. So, okay. But the others, well, maybe more guesses.
Hegel.
Hegel. Well, yeah, perhaps. Well, okay, it is Karl Marx. It's not a very typical Marxist statement, but it is Karl Marx. I should say that you don't play. Yeah. Okay, Karl Marx in Misère de la philosophie, his pamphlet against Proudhon. Yeah. So, I think this is interesting. It shows that there is in Marx a romantic moment. There is in Marx a romantic component. There is in Marx a romantic dimension, if you will. Yeah? And this is what I want to explore with you. But at the same time, immediately I have to add that Marx and Engels, I will speak for both, were not romantic things. They were not romantic things. But at the same time, they had something which I call romantic moment. And other thing important in the relationship between Marx, Engels, and Romanticism is that it was for them a source of inspiration. Usually, one says that Marx thought, Marxism, had three sources. There's a classical text by Lenin, the three sources of Marx. English political economy, German idealism, particularly Hegel, and French utopian socialism. Okay? And of course, these three are very important. But I would add that there is a fourth source of Marx, which is the romantic critique of capitalism, yeah? Which is as important as the other three. And we will see that Marx and Engels were very interested in the critique of romantics against modern civilization. This critique could come from writers like Balzac or Dickens, from political economists like Sismondi or Nikolai Danielson, from political essays like Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, from utopian socialists, which were romantic, some of them, from anthropologists, etc., etc. So this is the fourth important source of Marx and Engels, which they used to build their own way of thinking, which was not romanticism, but something else. Yeah? So what I want to explore is these sources and what Marx and Engels learned from the romantics. And you will see that it's quite relevant. But before that, I would like to read you one passage by Marx where he defines what is romanticism, what Marx believed romanticism is about. Just one paragraph, which can be found in the Grundrisse, the Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy, and you know, a manuscript which Marx wrote in the 1850s and then didn't publish, a kind of first draft of Capital. Anyhow, in this Grundrisse, you'll find one paragraph where Marx explains something about romanticism. And I think it's very interesting. So it begins like this. In previous periods of the human evolution, individuals enjoyed a greater plenitude, precisely because the plenitude of their conditions didn't confront them as independent powers, and this, therefore, this alienation had not yet taken place. So, first statement, very important. The plenitude of human life was greater in previous periods of human evolution. This is a classical romantic statement. Yeah? This is what the romantics are saying all the time. Yeah? Human life and a greater plenitude before capitalism arrived and destroyed everything and burned everything, dissolved everything. Yeah? So Marx seems to agree with the romantics. Yeah? There was a greater plenitude in previous times. Which previous times? It doesn't say. But previous before what? Before capitalism. Yeah? Before bourgeois society. So, in previous periods of human evolution, individuals enjoyed a greater plenitude, fullness. Yeah? It is as ridiculous to yearn for this past plenitude as to accept the present total void. This present society, bourgeois society, is total void. Terrible. But we cannot yearn for the past plenitude, cannot return to the past. So he rejects both the idea of returning to the past and the idea of accepting the present. And of course, he's thinking about a possible future, a different future. But then he continues. The bourgeois conception never was able to go beyond an opposition to the romantic viewpoint. It means the bourgeois only said to the romantics, you are wrong, you want to return to the past, this is nonsense, etc. You have to accept the present. So Marx, this is weak. The bourgeoisie has no real argument except opposing itself to the romantic viewpoint. And he goes on. And therefore, this romantic viewpoint will follow it, bourgeois society, as its legitimate counterpoint, berechtiger Gegensatz, until the happy disappearance of the bourgeoisie. End of the quote. Now, what is Marx saying here? That the romantic viewpoint that the past was, we should return to the fullness of the past, is impossible and he rejects it, but it's a legitimate counterposition to the bourgeois perspective or to the bourgeois society. So he acknowledged that there is some legitimacy to this romantic critique, even if in last analysis they are wrong because we cannot return to it. And he says this romantic critique of bourgeois society, this yearning for the past, will continue until the bourgeoisie disappears, until bourgeois society is finished. Now, since bourgeois society is not yet finished, it took longer than Marx predicted, romanticism is still here with us. That's what I said. Marx believed that as long as bourgeois society exists, the romantic critique, the romantic opposition to bourgeois society, which has some legitimacy, will continue to exist. Which is precisely our argument that romanticism began with Rousseau, but continues still today. Okay, but what you see from this passage is also that Marx takes distance himself from romanticism. He says this yearning to return to the past fullness is absurd. It doesn't make sense. We cannot return. Be it either the Middle Ages or ancient Greece or whatever in the past, we cannot return to the past. Okay. I think this passage by Marx says almost everything which has to be said about romanticism. Almost everything. What is missing? Just one thing, but it's important. That in the romantic worldview, there is a current, which I call revolutionary romanticism, which understands that you cannot return to the past fullness. It's impossible. But wants to do this movement, the tour through the past towards the future. Just to give an example, William Morris, who was a communist, anarchist, communist thinker, and at the same time an admirer of the Middle Ages. So he would visit the Middle Ages, but not to return to the Middle Ages, but to project a new communist anarchist society where some elements which existed in the Middle Ages still would be there in a different form, of course. So the only thing which is missing in this passage of the Goldwin is the existence of this romantic revolutionary culture. But otherwise, almost everything is here. Now is my time. So, Now, as I said, Marx and Engels learned a lot from the Romantic critics of capitalism, beginning with the writers. The writers, the Romantic writers, anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois Romantic writers were very, very important for them. And I will quote just two passages, one by Marx, one by Engels, where they speak of their debt, yeah, so to say, to these Romantic writers, which, by the way, were most of them women. Yeah? Okay. Now, the first one is Balzac, Honoré de Balzac. Yeah? It's not a woman, sorry. But it was very important for both Marx and Engels. And Engels wrote, I think it's a letter, I don't remember now, no, it's an article. Oh, I don't know. Anyhow, Engels said once that he has learned more from Balzac than from all the professional historians, economists, and statisticians of the period. Means I learned, say Engels, more about what is bourgeois society, how the bourgeoisie functions, the banks, finance capital, industrial capital, their conflicts, etc. Everything. I learned more from reading Balzac novels than from the old treatises of economy and history and etc. A very impressive homage. So I think we have to consider Balzac analysis, yeah, and criticism also of bourgeois society as an important source for Marx and Engels. And the same applies to English writers. And here is Marx, which says, he speaks of a group of English writers. Here he names Charles Dickens, Charlotte Brontë, and Mrs. Gaskell, two women, one man. He calls them the present splendid brotherhood, you could say sisterhood, of fiction writers in England, whose graphic and eloquent pages have issued to the world more political and social truths that have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. Very impressive. So he learned more by reading the novels by Mrs. Gaskell, Charlotte Brontë, and Dickens than by all these publicists, etc., etc., yeah? Politicians. So we have to take seriously Marx and Engels' depth towards the Romantic novelists and their very critical account of the functioning of industrial modern society. Now, I would like to say a few words now on Carlyle. Yeah? Carlyle is a typical conservative romantic. He was a Tory, yeah? So reactionary. And but his pamphlets, his essays, were a sharp criticism of bourgeois society. And Engels very much appreciated Carlyle's writings, and he paid homage to them in two essays which I would like to mention, different periods of his life, but he has an interesting assessment of Carlyle, which says also something about Engels and Marx's relationship to Romanticism. So, speaking of past and present, an essay which Carlyle published in 1843, I think, something like that. Well, Thomas Carlyle, says Engels, was originally a Tory conservative, the aristocracy. this much is certain. A Whig was the part of the liberal bourgeoisie, a Whig would never have been able to write a book that was half so humane as Past and Present. Surprising. Yeah? By being a conservative, a Tory, a reactionary, an aristocrat, not partisan of the aristocracy, he was able to write this humane book. And his philosophy was inspired by Tory romanticism, says Engels, but he was able to correctly apprehend the immediate present of bourgeois society. In spite of his Tory, conservative, romantic, he was able to understand the immediate, correctly understand the immediate present. So this is a comment by the young Engels from 1844. But several years later, in 1850, he returned to Carlyle, to this romantic Tory. And here is what he says. To Thomas Carlyle belongs the credit of having taken the literary field against the bourgeoisie at a time when the views, tastes, and ideas of the bourgeoisie hold the whole of official English literature. And Thomas Carlyle did this to fight literally against the bourgeoisie in a manner which at times was even revolutionary. For example, in his books on Chartism, Past and Present, etc., etc. But in all these writings, continues Engels, the critique of the present, the bourgeois society, is closely bound up with a strangely unhistorical apotheosis of the Middle Ages. Yeah? So, at the same time, it was a sharp critic of bourgeois society. This criticism, at moments, you could consider it almost as revolutionary, but at the same time, he was yearning for the Middle Ages. Huh? And this apotheosis of the Middle Ages, continues Engels, is a frequent characteristic of other English revolutionaries too. For instance, Cobbett was a democratic revolutionary leader of the early 19th century, and a section of the Chartists. The Chartists was the big first labor movement in England. So this passage by Engels is very interesting. So, because he understands that the romantic critique of the present of bourgeois society is intimately linked with this, closely bound, let me say, with this Tory romanticism, with this nostalgia for the past, etc. But in spite of this, at certain moment it can become revolution. So this is a quite interesting assessment of Carlyle by Friedrich Engels. Now, let me say a few words about the Communist Manifesto, which is, of course, the best known writing by Marx and Engels, and also one of their least romantic writings, I would say. Why? Because the manifesto seems an enthusiastic celebration of bourgeois progress. Yeah? Bourgeoisie developed the productive forces, they created fantastic inventions, and what they produced is much more important than the pyramids of Egypt or anything in the past. So it seems really a kind of celebration of bourgeois civilization, of capitalist progress, etc. So exactly the opposite of it. But if we do a close reading of the Communist Manifesto, you will see that the romantic moment, the romantic dimension, is present also in the Communist Manifesto. And I will give just a few examples. Yeah? First, there is a passage in the manifesto where Marx Engels write that see, in bourgeois society, personal dignity became a simple exchange value, and human relations were replaced by cash payment, and drowned in the icy waters of calculating egoism. Well-known passage. Well, there is a sound that it sounds very similar to some things which Carlyle wrote. This Carlyle said in bourgeois society or in modern society, the only relation between the human beings is what he calls the cash nexus. The only link is payment. I don't know you, you don't know me. I buy something, I pay you, you give me the money, the change, and that's it. There's no other relation except cash nexus. This is Carlyle, and Marx and Engels take this argument, to some extent in the Common Manifesto. And they say this personal dignity in bourgeois society became a simple exchange value. To say that it became an exchange value is to say that before bourgeois society, personal dignity had some sort of existence. It was not an exchange value, it was something. So this is a typical romantic argument. That before bourgeois society, the value of personal dignity had an existence, but in bourgeois society it was replaced by exchange value. It became a commodity. Personal dignity became a commodity which you can buy in the market. So this is one typical romantic moment in the humanist manifesto. But another moment is when he discusses forms of utopian socialism which they reject, they criticize. They criticize as petit bourgeois, reactionary, etc. But while criticizing, they have some kind of acknowledgement. So I will give you two examples. I'm not going to speak of utopian socialism because there is obvious that Marx and Engels had a strong relation with utopian socialism, with Fourier, etc. But I'm going to speak of a more conservative or even reactionary form of romanticism, which Marx and Engels called, ironically, feudal socialism. Feudal socialism. Of course, they criticize that these people are ridiculous. These landowners, these aristocrats, these bishops, clergymen, theologians who claim that they are on the side of the workers and that they want a kind of Christian socialism. So he obviously rejected feudal socialism. But while rejecting it, they said something about it which is quite interesting. What is feudal socialism? It's a sui generis blend of the echoes of the past, in feudal socialism, want to return to feudalism, past, medieval time, with the menace of the future. And somehow these people are also talking of the future. Strange mixture. Now, feudal socialism has a total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. They don't understand that capitalism destroys feudalism definitively. There is no way to return, etc. So they don't understand the march of modern history. But at the same time, they have the merit of, at times, by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticism of striking the bourgeoisie at the very heart's core. Quite surprising knowledge. These people, they don't understand nothing about the historical process, etc., etc. But their criticism of the bourgeoisie is witty, is bitter, incisive, and it goes back to the heart of the bourgeoisie. So it's a kind of homage. And the interesting thing is that this phrase on feudal socialism, on these people, is almost a literary, word-by-word quote from Balzac. Yes? Balzac has a novel called Le Cabinet des Anticités, Cabinet of Anticities, where, among other things, there is a scene where he describes a confrontation, a polemic between a liberal bourgeois, liberal in the European sense, not in American, and a aristocrat, conservative. Huh? And Balzac says that the stronger arguments were those of the conservative, because, of course, he, Balzac, was with the conservatives. He was a monarchist, a legitimist. So he says the conservative arguments were bitter, witty, and incisive, and they went directly to the heart of the bourgeois. Exactly the same word. Very surprising. So Marx took this phrase from this novel of Balzac, which he read, of course, and it appears in the Communist Manifesto. It's very interesting. In describing, criticizing, but at the same time paying homage to the inverted commas feudal socialism. One wonders who were these feudal socialists, which Marx and Engels criticized, but at the same time were interested in. They don't give names. One of them, just an hypothesis, in my view, could be a German Catholic theologian called Johannes von Baader. Probably you never heard that name, but in the 19th century was quite well known. And Johannes Baader was a strange bird because on one side he was all for king and church, and he supported the Pope and the Tsar and the King of England and the King of France, and etc. He was a monarchy. So he was a Tory, let's say, a German Tory. But at the same time, he was a ferocious critique of capitalism. He called it the Manchesterian economy of the bourgeoisie. And more surprising, he showed a keen solidarity with the proletariat. And he used the word, he was one of the first to use the word proletariat. He said proletaires in German. So he was one of the first to speak of the proletariat. And he said the proletariat is the victim of the system, capitalist, and the church should take the defense of the proletariat, should be the spokesperson of the proletariat, etc. Which of course was a dream. Yeah? So maybe Johannes von Baader is one of these feudal socialists to which Marx and Engels are referring. Now, another reactionary socialist, which Marx and Engels criticize in the manifesto, is Sismondi. Sismondi was an economist, a romantic economist, who criticized bourgeois society, capitalism, but his aspiration was to return to the times when production was done by small peasants and artisans. Yeah? That was his ideal of society. A society of small peasants and artisans against bourgeois, modern bourgeois society. And Marx and Engels say, of course, this is rubbish. Yeah? You cannot return to artisan production and small peasant production. Nonsense. Yeah? So they reject Sismondi as a petty bourgeois reactionary socialist. But at the same time, they say the criticism of Sismondi of bourgeois society is quite relevant. Now, let me quote one passage. Sismondi, this petty bourgeois socialist, dissected with great acuteness the contradictions inherent in the condition of modern production and laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists, bourgeois economists. He proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor in capital. The concentration of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction and crisis. He pointed out the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeoisie and peasants, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy of production, the crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth. End of quote. Almost most of Marx and Engels' criticisms of capitalism are already here. Yeah? So Marx and Engels took a lot, yeah, from Sismondi's critique of bourgeois economy. Yeah? So, in spite of rejecting, of course, his proposals, his petty bourgeois socialism. Yeah? Okay, so this is to show that even the manifesto, which is the least romantic writing by Marx and Engels, has this significant romantic component. Now, let me see my time. Well, I could go on and on with other examples. Let me just mention very briefly that, yeah, there's at least one thing more to be said. Marx and Engels were very interested in historians and anthropologists who studied primitive communities. Primitive communities. Not only pre-capitalist or pre-modern, but before the Middle Age, sometimes before Greek or Roman antiquity, primitive communities, which in Europe, of course, existed throughout the centuries, yes, in the so-called barbarian civilizations, etc. And one of the persons who studied these primitive communities in Europe, in the German tribes, let's say, was an historian called Maurer. And Marx wrote a letter to Engels from 1868 where he discussed Maurer's book on these primitive communities. And this comment of Marx is very interesting. He says, the first reaction to the French Revolution and Enlightenment was naturally regarded, hoped for, or was influenced by a medieval romantic attitude. But the second reaction to the French Revolution or Enlightenment, bourgeois society, the second reaction is to look beyond the Middle Ages into the primitive age of every people. And this corresponds to the socialist tendency. Means we, the socialists, we don't look to the good medieval times. We don't believe in good medieval times. Right? We look to the primitive ages because this is something which interests us as socialists. Right? And though these learned men like Maurer, these historians, have no idea that they are connected with socialism. And they, Maurer and other such historians, are then surprised to find what is newest in what is oldest. What is newest is communism. And what is older is the primitive age. Yeah? And find even egalitarianism to a degree which would have made Proudhon shudder. Yeah? End of the quote. So, what he's saying is that there are two attitudes, two reactions to bourgeois society, enlightenment, originated with one which looks back to the Middle Age, and one who looks beyond the Middle Age to the primitive ages, and to see that in these primitive ages there was equality, and a sort of primitive communism. And they will use the term primitive communism. And Engels will develop this also very much later in Origins of the Family and Private Property, etc., where he speaks of primitive communism and he refers to the indigenous tribes in North America, the Iroquois Federation, and he's full of praise for this primitive communist society, where he says there were no policemen, no judges, no state, no oppression. Everybody was equal, including the woman, says, etc., etc. So that is full of praise for this primitive communist society. But of course, he's not proposing to return to primitive communism, but to struggle for a new communism beyond bourgeois society, which would again retrieve these elements of the past which had been lost. And one more example, which is quite relevant, is Marx's last writings about the Russian commune, the Russian rural commune. Perhaps no to you. Marx had a correspondence with a Russian revolutionary woman called Vera Zasulich at a time when there was a discussion among Russian revolutionaries if socialism in Russia could be developed starting with the traditional collectivist traditions, the collectivist traditions, sorry, of the rural communities, the age-old rural Russian rural community called Община. Okay, so there was a debate. Some revolutionaries, particularly the populists, the Narodniki, believed that the peasant tradition, the peasant socialist traditions could be the starting point to a socialist future for Russia. But Marx, the follower of Marx, had doubts. This is why Vera Zasulich consulted Marx. What did he think? And surprisingly, Marx sided with the Narodniki. He said, yes, I think that the Russian rural commune is old, age-old, archaic. He said, it's an archaic form. But we shouldn't be afraid of archaic forms. Sometimes they can be revolutionary. So this archaic, traditional rural community, the Община, could perhaps be the starting point for a revolutionary process in Russia, thus sparing Russia to go throughout all the capitalist process of evolution. So a kind of skipping, to some extent, capitalism by developing a revolution on the basis of this rural community. Of course, this didn't happen, but what I'm interested here is the kind of thinking of Marx, of old Marx, just 1 year before he died, that these traditional forms could be part of a revolutionary process. Well, now, in the 10 minutes which I still have, or 5, I will just say a few words about what happened after Marx died. There developed a heretical, dissident, minority current in Marxism, but not irrelevant, which I think could be defined as romantic Marxism. As I said, Marx and Engels themselves were not romantic. They were more on the side of enlightenment, I would say. In any case, what they try to do is to, what in dialectic we call an Aufhebung, that means overcoming the contradiction between enlightenment and romanticism and produce something new, something different. So in any case, they were, one cannot say that they were romantics. But in the 20th century, let's say, there appears a current of people which can be defined as Marxist romantics. The first of them is William Morris, who was a conservative and a romantic dreamer who thought of the Middle Age, and who became a socialist, a revolutionary, a communist, an anarchist, without abandoning his nostalgia for the Middle Age. That's it. I cannot go into detail, but William Morris is the first example of what I call romantic Marxism. And he had a significant influence in the Marxist left in England. two important names in English Marxism, which are Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson, are to a large extent indebted to William Morris. And E.P. Thompson, as you know perhaps, wrote his first important book was a biography, a collected biography of William Morris. So this is one example of what I call romantic Marxism. But there is one current also in Central Europe. People like the young Georg Lukács, Ernst Bloch, not only in his early writing, but throughout his whole life, Walter Benjamin, etc. So I think you can show that in Central Europe, Jewish culture, etc., mainly, you can find also this kind of romantic Marxism. But the example I would like to emphasize a little bit more is much less well known, but I think very significant. It's an example of Latin America. And I want to say a few words now about the founder of Latin American Marxism, who died in 1930, called José Carlos Mariátegui. José Carlos Mariátegui. So Mariátegui was a Marxist, but a quite heretical, heterodox Marxist. He was basically a romantic Marxist. This is why he was very much interested in surrealism. By the way, André Breton, from surrealism, is another example of romantic Marxism. So, but Mariátegui wrote about Peru and about Latin America. And his hypothesis was the following. In the history of Latin America, before the Spanish conquerors arrived, so-called pre-Columbus times, there existed a form of primitive communism. And in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, etc., we could call this Inca communism. Use the term Inca communism. Which means not that the Inca was a communist, not at all, he was a despot, but that at the basis of the society, the rural communities functioned in a communist way of collective property, collective labor, etc. So there was a kind of collectivistic agriculture at the basis of this Inca empire. So this was very polemical, and it was very much criticized by using the term Inca communism. So he was told by Soviet critics and by other Orthodox communists that this is romanticism. You are completely in opposition to Marxism. Yeah? This is pure romanticism, etc. But we saw that Marx, about Russia, the Russian community, had said something very simple. But the most curious thing is that the words, the term Inca communism, appear in a writing by Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg gave a course called Introduction to Political Economy at the school of the Social Democratic Party around 1907, 1908, which was published only after her death in the 20s. And in this Introduction to Political Economy, there's a large chapter on primitive communism. And there she speaks of Inca communism. But of course, Mariátegui didn't know about this because he didn't read German. So he was not familiar with those things. Anyhow. So, but not only he talked about Inca communism, but he believed that the modern revolutionary movement in Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, etc., could use these collectivist traditions of the indigenous communities to develop a modern Marxist, communist, revolutionary movement. Yeah? So this was his strategy. Yeah? And this is why he said that socialism or communism in Latin America should not be copy of other experiences, like the Russian, but should be a creation, he said a heroic creation, of the Indo-American peoples. Yeah? He used Indo-American instead of Latin American, the Indo-American peoples, starting from these communist traditions of the indigenous communities. Voilà, merci beaucoup. Now, if you have questions, comments, protests, etc., please. We still have a little bit. Half an hour. Not all at the same time. Yes? Oh yeah, a mic is useful. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Louder. Sorry, my ears are not good.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a lot of comments, but I just wanted to ask you one question, which is what do you think about you mentioned Sismond, you mentioned the utopian socialists and how they influence Karl Marx and Engels. I wanted to ask you what do you think of where do you place the influence of Saint-Simon in Marxism?
Okay.
And what do you think of Saint-Simon as an influential figure of Karl Marx?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that Saint-Simon is a romantic. No? He was a strong believer in progress. He was a sort of disciple of Condorcet, who was the most splendid representative of enlightenment and faith in progress, yes, science, etc. So it's all the opposite of romanticism. But even Saint-Simon, which again is a pure expression of the best, the best elements in the Enlightenment tradition, even in him you could find some romantic elements when, for instance, he would say that we need a new religion, a new religion, a new Christianity, based on the needs of the poor, etc. So this is a kind of romantic. But well, Saint-Simon was a sort of utopian socialist, if you want, and therefore he attracted the interest of Marx and Engels. They thought that some of his socialist proposals were interesting. Of course, they criticized him because he had much empathy with the suffering of the poor, and he said that we have to organize society in order to improve the life of the poorest, but he didn't understand that these poor and the suffering, etc., are the only possible subject of a transformation of society. He didn't see them as subject of revolution, but just as object of attention by a charitable government of new Christian socialists or something like that. So, but still, Marx and Engels had a lot of interest in Saint-Simon's writing, and they took one idea from Saint-Simon, which frankly I believe wasn't a very good one, but they quote him very often. When Saint-Simon said that in a future, in a socialist society, the government over people will be replaced by the administration of things. That means in a future society there will be an efficient administration of things. Things mean what? I suppose goods, machines, products, etc. And there will be no more government over man. Which means, you could say, no more politics, only economy. And I think this is a relief. But this is a Saint-Simon idea which Marx and Engels took seriously. Of course, the Saint-Simonian school then divided. There were radical elements, particularly feminist radical elements, because there was a component of feminism in the Saint-Simonian school. There was a revolutionary feminist socialist woman called Claire Demar, who was a dissident from the Saint-Simon school. But other followers of Saint-Simon just became capitalists, bankers, industrialists. Yeah? They applied Saint-Simon their own way. They say, we are doing what Saint-Simon said, which is to bring progress to humanity and improve the sort of the poorest by opening factories and banks and things like that. So this was a kind of bourgeois version of Saint-Simon. Please. Okay.
Thank you. If I may. Is this on? Oh. I am wondering what you would say to there's a certain kind of school of thought, I think emanating from the world systems theorists, that would argue Romanticism is a more general phenomenon. It is not only something that emerged in the 19th century as a critique of capitalism at that time, but a more general phenomenon of civilizational critique that has emerged many times in history. And that it would include also the primitivist approach of finding something beneficial in a pre-civilizational situation. These world system theories might say that this is something that's happened many times. There have been romantics many times, even though they may not have been called romantics.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look, I agree and I disagree with this. Yeah? I would say, of course, in history, there always have been people who said it was better before. There is even in Rome, for instance, there was a whole school of people who argued this, and they were called laudator temporis acti, the people who celebrate past time, right? So it's true that this always exists, in one form or another. But I call Romanticism, and it's not only me, it's what we can call Romanticism, what Marx calls also Romanticism, is something more specific. It's a critique of bourgeois, industrial, Western, capitalist society in the name of the past. Something more specific. And is related to a critique of specific aspects of the bourgeois industrial society, which didn't exist neither in ancient Rome nor in, I don't know. Yeah? So what we call Romanticism is this phenomenon which is specific to modern society, which appeared with the Industrial Revolution as a protest against this new phenomenon, which is Industrial Revolution, bourgeois society, capitalism, which brought something new, which didn't exist neither in Rome nor in Greece nor in Babylon or whatever. Yeah? So in this sense, Romanticism is something specific to modern world and bourgeois society, in spite of the fact that this frame of mind or this attitude is something which has always existed in our society. Okay? Please.
My question is connecting three parts of the talk. The way that Enzo presented you as interested in eco-socialism. The second point you mentioned, romantic worldview was against the mechanization of the world, and romantic socialism as might have this aspect of like Inca communism. So I was wondering if revolutionary romanticism goes to the past to go to the future, how can we understand a relationship to ecology or nature in that way?
Good.
And yeah.
Very good question. I would say my answer to this question will be a book which I'm and you will take several hundred pages to answer your question. But precisely inspired by this idea. Yeah? I mean, the book is about Romanticism, anti-capitalism, and nature or ecology. Yeah? And the idea is to show how, throughout a few centuries, let's say, since Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there has been a romantic protest against the destruction of the environment, of nature, of the landscape, of animal life, etc., by modern society, industry, capitalism, etc. Yeah? So this is something which goes from, as I said, Rousseau, throughout several authors, artists, poets, thinkers, etc., throughout the 19th century, 20th, etc. In this book, we discuss some specific figures. One of them is a painter. And I recommend you to, if you go to New York, don't miss the exposition of this painter called Thomas Cole. It's at the Metropolitan Museum. So Thomas Cole is a typical example of this romantic, conservative, he was a kind of Tory, conservative critique of bourgeois society because it is destroying the landscape, the nature, the Garden of Eden, which is America. You believe America is a Garden of Eden, but is becoming a hell because of industry, progress, civilization, capitalism. So Thomas Cole is a striking example. The other figure we discussed is William Morris, of course. William Morris is also such a figure. And then we talk about Walter Benjamin, which has this question of the destruction of nature in some of his writing. And we come to Raymond Williams. Precisely, he is the kind of one of the founders of eco-socialism, if you want, Raymond Williams. And he is a romantic Marxist. And our final figure is Naomi Klein. Yeah? We end with Naomi Klein. And we discussed how Naomi Klein relates to romanticism, which is not the way the others do, it's a different way. Yeah? So now, not all ecology, of course, and not all eco-socialism are romantics. Yeah? Some of them are people from enlightenment, believe in modernity, in progress, society, etc. Yeah? But there is a current in the history of ecology, say, on the reflection on nature and its protest against the destruction of the environment, which has romantic roots and strong romantic ambition. So I would say there exists an romantic eco-socialism, but it's not the only possible form of eco-socialism. Please, you.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about temporality. If we
About?
think about time, and if we think about if we take into account how romanticism is important, which I agree with you, and if we think about progress or how time moves, in the question of if romanticism is a part of it, and thinking about how thinking about the past, right? Going into the past to think about the future, and how Marx doesn't think about how this is important. How does this affect the progression of time? Like you were talking about thinking into how these authors are romantic Marxists, like Benjamin and Locke, right? Their idea of progress is different, right? So does this, thinking about them as romantic Marxists, right? We think that going back into time is necessary, right, for revolution, or that time is not linear. If we think that romanticism is necessary or romantic thought is necessary for Marx, would that mean that time would have to change, or that linear time would have to change?
Yeah. Well, of course, in Romanticism there is a critique of the linear view of time typical of the progressive view of history. Yeah? The idea that history is a process of permanent progress leading to freedom, happiness, etc. Yeah? Which you can find in Enlightenment, but also in Hegel, yeah? And in some writings of Marx too. Yeah? And probably one can say that the dominant trend in Marxism throughout the 20th century at least was inspired by this idea of progress. Yeah? History is progress. Yeah? Our communist future is the inevitable result of progress, of the development of productive forces, etc. Yeah? So this idea is very strong in the Marxist tradition. And the Romantics were those who rejected this view, and they didn't believe in progress. And Marx and Engels themselves, sometimes they would lean towards such a progressive view of history, but usually they had what I would call a dialectical view of progress. Yeah? I mean, they would say, right, capitalism brought fantastic progress in terms of science, technology, development of productive forces, but at a price which is unbearable, yeah? At the price of social and cultural regressions, yeah? Etc. So this, I would say, is seeing progress as contradiction. Yeah? There's a text by Engels, very interesting, I will quote, but where he says exactly this, that to see history from the Middle Ages till now, it says, as linear progress is a bourgeois illusion. Yeah? We have to see it as contradictory. Yeah? In some sense, it's an advance, and others a regression. Yeah? Well, and this is the idea which has been taken up some way or another by the Romantic Marxists, like Paul Benedict, Ernst Bloch, etc. I cannot develop it. Will demand a course of at least 1 year, yeah? To speak only of Waterbury. Two more questions, yeah. I would give the priority to women, but
should I take the microphone?
yeah.
It's coming.
Okay. So thank you very much. You're hearing it. Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. And since I'm called out as a woman, I will ask a woman question. and that is Claire Desmar. Now, I've only read about the flesh of Claire Desmar. I discovered her through Walter Benjamin. I can't see her as a romantic. So here's my question. You did mention certain women novelists.
Yeah.
But would I be totally off base if I said that women in this constellation of figures who you, or times you've talked about, or places, are not romantics? That's the question. Even if they are revolutionaries, and certainly Claire Desmar was.
Well, vast question. No, I think there have been romantic women. For instance, in the early 19th century in Germany, Bettina Brentano, etc. The whole array of women who were part of the romantic movement. Yeah? That's one thing. Yeah? And but of course, many women and feminists were not romantic. I agree with you that Claire de Mar, I wouldn't say she was romantic. Perhaps there are some romantic moments, yeah, but I wouldn't say she's romantic. Yeah. So,
Might there be a reason for that?
Maybe, I don't know. You can say that in pre-modern societies, women were more oppressed than in modern society. It's an argument which could be made. But, so romantics would say, okay, in the feudal society, women were oppressed, but in primitive communism, pre-medieval times, there was greater equality between men. There's a discussion going on among the two parties. I'm not going to. Yeah. But let me just give one contemporary example of a romantic woman, okay, which is as the last chapter of our book, Naomi Klein. Huh? Naomi Klein. Now, Naomi Klein is not a typical romantic thinker because she doesn't have a strong connection to the romantic tradition. Yeah? Her references are not neither Hölderlin nor Schiller nor William Morris, etc. No. So she doesn't seem to be. But at least in one of her books, which is This Changed Everything, which is a very important book, she has a strong commitment to indigenous movements, indigenous communities, struggling against capitalist progress, development, modernization, in the form of oil companies, coal mining, etc., etc. And she says these indigenous communities in the United States, in Canada, in Latin America, etc., in Nigeria, are struggling in the name of their ancient traditions, their ancient customs, their ancient spirituality, their traditional relation to the natural environment, which is sacred for them. The land, the rivers, the mountains, the forest are sacred for them. And it's this attitude, which is pre-modern, which inspires their struggle. And she admires this very much. Of course, she's not saying we can live like the indigenous communities, but she says we can learn something. And this is the revolutionary Marxism. Okay.
So maybe this is a good time to end this. There is a reception at the Art History Gallery down the hall, and you can continue the conversation there. Okay, thank you very much.